Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. 8 years ago, Tacloban in the Philippines was hit by what the press described as the world's strongest storm ever recorded. About 6,000 people drowned in the storm surge. The conservative British Prime Minister David Cameron announced that the storm was caused by climate change. And the Philippines' lead climate negotiator said the storm was like nothing we had ever experienced before, or perhaps nothing that any country has ever experienced before. That sounds really bad, except for the fact that he doesn't know what he's talking about. In 1912, a very similar typhoon hit the same spot in the Philippines and killed 15,000 people. There was an appalling loss of life, which was described by the press as being a holocaust. The New York Times reported that the town of Tacloban was practically destroyed. 2 steamers were wrecked in the storm, and this came just a few weeks after the wreck of the Titanic. That was in 1912, and 15 years prior to that, another typhoon destroyed the same city. During November of 1897, Tacloban was destroyed by a typhoon that killed more than 6,000 people. Some newspapers estimated that 7,000 people died in the 1897 storm. Thousands of natives are roaming about the devastated province seeking food and medical attention. In many cases, the corpses were mutilated as though they had fallen in battle. David Cameron said that the same weather as 1897 and 1912 is proof that the climate has changed. My beautiful wife Kyrie made this graph from Japan Meteorological Agency data showing that the number of typhoons in the Pacific has declined over the last 50 years. This graph from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology shows the same thing. The number of both severe and non-severe typhoons has declined over the last 50 years. Now let's move across to the other side of the Pacific. In 2015, Hurricane Patricia hit Mexico, and the New York Times declared it was the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. It was all over the press. Mexico braces for Patricia, strongest hurricane ever recorded. But then when Patricia made landfall, it caused little damage. I made this screenshot just as Patricia made landfall, showing that wind speeds were actually quite low. The reports of record wind speed were made from airplanes at altitude when the storm was about 50 miles offshore. It's ridiculous to compare those wind speeds against onshore wind speeds of other hurricanes. It's an apples versus oranges comparison. Winds at altitude offshore are always going to be much higher than ground wind speeds during a hurricane. The storm blew the leaves right off the trees, and 2 weeks later the leaves were already growing back. This is what the New York Times described as the strongest hurricane ever. And 1 year later, the Washington Post was terrified by an unprecedented lack of hurricanes hitting the United States. The U.S. coast is experiencing an unprecedented hurricane drought. Why this is terrifying. Hurricanes large and small have eluded U.S. shores for record lengths of time. If we get hurricanes, the Washington Post is terrified and blames it on climate change. If we don't get hurricanes, the Washington Post is terrified and they blame it on climate change. There's nothing new about this nonsense. It's been going on for at least 150 years. Brisbane Courier, January 10, 1871. Imaginary changes of climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. For at least the past 150 years, the press has been making up fake statistics about unprecedented weather. But now they use their fake statistics to create an imaginary link between carbon dioxide and bad weather. And then they use their fake science as justification to travel to nice places and hold climate boondoggles. And then at their fake climate boondoggles, they make fake climate agreements which do nothing to slow down the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Dogs are very fast learners, and Toto wonders why humans are so slow. Democratic voters fall for the same scams from politicians and the press over and over again, year after year, decade after decade. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, and Caesar on the web at RealClimateScience.com.